41 days. 41 days away from the most consequential election since 1864. Depending on how this election turns out, the United States of America could look drastically different from the United States of America that we've gotten accustomed to. In one corner, we have Vice President Kamala Harris, rallying her base with a Democratic super PAC, unleashing ads to define her as the people's candidate, as the people's prosecutor in battleground states. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, a former president who's no stranger to political warfare, now finds himself trailing Harris in crucial swing states that could determine the outcome. This election isn't just about campaigning ads and battleground state polls. Joining me is a man who constantly rejects the polls and instead, in the words of Scottish philosopher and historian David Hume, consigns them to the flames. Professor Allan Lichtman's track record in predicting elections is unmatched. If there's one person who can cut through the headlines and tell us where this election is really heading, it's Professor Allan Lichtman. If you're a longtime listener to the Political Mic, you will remember that this isn't Professor Lichtman's first appearance on the show, but today is special. This is his first time joining us since officially making his prediction for the 2024 presidential election. His 13 Keys to the White House model has accurately predicted every presidential election since 1984, and today he's here to tell us whether those keys unlock the door for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in 2024. In the midst of all the chaos and noise, Professor Lichtman's model disregards all the polls and taps into the fundamental forces that really drive presidential elections. With Democrats hammering Trump as a threat to democracy and Harris positioning herself as the key to America's future, what does his model say about this epic showdown that's about to take place in November? Professor Lichtman, thank you for being part of the Political Mic again today.
My pleasure, Mike.
So, Professor, you've released your prediction. It was released in the New York Times with a video, and so many other media outlets have caught on and have shared your prediction. What is your prediction, and can you walk us through how you came to that conclusion using your 13 Keys to the White House model?
All right, I'll give you the punchline first, then I'll tell you how we got there. The punchline is that according to the Keys to the White House, my prediction system that's been right since 1984, we will have a new and path-breaking American president. That is, Kamala Harris will become the first woman president of the United States, at least cracking, if not shattering, the glass ceiling. And she will become the first president of mixed African and East Asian descent, foreshadowing where America's going. As you know, Mike, we're rapidly becoming a majority-minority country. Old white guys like me are on the decline. So how did I get there? Not by following the pundits who are my buddies, but have no scientific basis for their opinions. It's sports talk radio. It's fun, but that's it. Certainly not following the polls, which are snapshots, and that's fine. But they're abused as predictors by clerks like Nate Silver, who compile polls and then give you these phony probabilities of wins and losses based on the polls. I'll never forget in 2016, he said Hillary Clinton had a 70 to 80% chance of winning, depending on the time of day you checked in with him. Then when she loses, he says, oh, see, I told you she had a 20% plus chance of losing. So it's meaningless. The keys to the White House, in contrast, as you accurately point out and very eloquently, tap into the structure of how American presidential elections really work as votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. Imagine that. The big message is it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. And the way it works, if 5 or fewer of the keys go against the White House party, they are predicted winners. If 6 or more go against them, they are predicted losers. So 6 strikes and you're out, 5 or fewer strikes and you're in. So let's go over the keys and see whether Harris has 5 or fewer or 6 or more against her. Remember, it's always measured against the White House party, not keys for or against the challenger. So what has Harris lost? The mandate key, because they lost U.S. House elections in 2022. The incumbency key, the incumbent's no longer running. The incumbent charisma key, whatever you may think of Harris, in a couple of months, she's not risen to the level of a Franklin Roosevelt. This is a very high threshold key. That's 3. 4, foreign policy failure. I count Gaza as a failure. It's a humanitarian catastrophe with no end in sight, no solution. And although we don't have boots on the ground there, we are heavily implicated in what goes on in the Middle East. And we do have troops around and, ships, warships. So that's 4 negative keys, 2 short of the 6 needed to predict her defeat. And there's only one other shaky key, and it's not really shaky. I give them a foreign military success for Ukraine because it was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West, stop Putin from conquering Ukraine and threatening America's national security by going after our NATO allies, which would have been next. This will go down as an historic presidential achievement.
So, Professor Lichtman, I remember when there was so much noise within the Democratic Party to push and pressure President Biden to not seek a second term. I don't remember or think in American history there was ever a time when the party, without a scandal, without some kind of negative consequence going in their direction, pressuring the sitting incumbent president to not seek re-election. I was very disappointed in a lot of the Democratic leadership, like Jamie Raskin, Nancy Pelosi, Jason Crow, a lot of folks who were going around. And then you had people in Hollywood, George Clooney. You had donors like Abigail Disney withholding their funds. I got a glimmer of hope with your video when you said that you spoke to your friend who was a longtime Biden advisor, Ron Klain. I was so excited. I literally leaped around in my room because I felt as if the incumbency key was secured for the Democratic Party. That came to a crashing halt on the following Sunday, which was July 21st, when I was in a Democratic meeting and someone abruptly raised their hand and said, Biden dropped out. And, I was at headquarters. It was a grand opening. A lot of local candidates were making their pitch, and the wind, literally, you could feel the wind just leaving the room. Now, we've never had a situation where the incumbent doesn't run for re-election and there's no party contest. Am I correct? Thinking about 1952, 68, 19.
We've had a few.
Okay.
Let me clarify all of this, okay? I get what you're saying. And like you, of course, I was extremely critical of spineless Democrats, openly and viciously trashing their incumbent president right in the open. I've never seen that before, and I've studied politics in America from the founding to the present. I also thought, as you know, because you heard my video, that the Democrats were heading for disaster, that they would not only push Biden out and lose the incumbency key, but have a big party brawl and lose the contest key. And no White House party has ever been reelected since 1900 when losing both of those keys. But maybe the Democrats listen to me. I can't say, but they seem to have grown a spine and a brain and united behind Harris to salvage the contest key. And there have been historical examples of open seats without a contest where the White House party has won. Herbert Hoover, for example, in 1928, and George H.W. Bush in 1988. So somehow the Democrats averted disaster and united behind Harris. Plus, clearly they did lose the incumbency key. I talked about that. But I think Harris's candidacy also helped the Democrats salvage 2 other keys. The third party key, because voters no longer had to choose between 2 old white guys. Hate saying that being an old white guy myself, but I think that's true. And I think that contributed to the fizzling of RFK Jr. Social unrest. The protests were directed against Biden, but with Biden in the background and Harris in the foreground, the protests have fizzled. So the bottom line is the keys to the White House fully take into account and incorporate all of the unprecedented changes that occurred within the Democratic Party this year.
And I remember when you debated Cenk on the Young Turks, and one of the key parts of that debate I remember is when he said, well, no president has been reelected with less than 38%, or I think that was the number, 38%. Isn't it the case that Harry Truman, as a professor of American history and historian, isn't it true that Truman was actually polling underwater, and that's
absolutely
why he he was holding up the newspaper that had already predicted his defeat. Dewey defeats Truman. And so my argument to those, going before the Harris candidacy took off was, why are we getting so caught up on this one debate? I mean, has there ever been a debate that really determined the outcome of a presidential election in your view?
Never. Hillary Clinton won all the debates and still lost. John Kerry won the debates against a terrible debate of George W. Bush. Al Gore at least tied, maybe won, the debates in 2000. There's no predictive value of debates, although obviously the Biden debate did change. But that was, as I explained, fully accounted for by the keys. And by the way, Biden is well over 38% right now. So, these ephemeral polls constantly change. I think he's somewhere around 43, 44%, so well above 38%.
And Professor, there's some folks that, as a disciple of your 13 Keys model, I've been finding myself in debates with. A lot of them say, well, Professor Lichtman, he predicted the winner of the popular vote, but after the 2016 election, he emphasized his ability to predict the electoral college outcomes instead. Could you clarify why this shift occurred, or was there a shift?
Yeah,
and do you
absolutely.
believe?
From well over 100 years, retrospectively and prospectively, when I was doing predictions, there was no daylight between the popular and the electoral college vote. A couple of elections skewed by Reconstruction, but that's it. And so there was no issue. I didn't have to draw distinctions. But in recent years, the popular vote has become irrelevant because the Democrats compile 5 to 6 million extra votes in just New York and California, votes that count for nothing in the electoral college. This is a much more serious issue for our democracy than for my predictions. That's why in recent years, I have only called winners and losers. I have paid no attention to the popular vote. And there's been a lot of confusion about this. But if you look at my Washington Post interview, where I made my call, I said Donald Trump is headed for a win, not a popular vote plurality. And at the same time, I said when he wins, he's going to be impeached. If I was just talking about the popular vote, it would have been no sense. Plus, I got a letter of congratulations from Donald Trump, congratulating me for predicting his win. I won the Steckler Award for Courage in Forecasting for predicting his win. A whole host of eminent political scientists recognized, including Gerald M. Pomper, the Dean of Political Science. I was asked to do an article in the Harvard Data Science Review to present my analysis to the American Political Science Association as an historian. But now, people who don't like my Harris prediction 8 years later are trying to claim I was really calling the popular vote. Utter nonsense in 2016. Just ask Donald Trump.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but there are two keys that, they're still up in the air, but you still were able to make your predictions without them. And I think foreign policy is the one that you alluded to just now.
Yeah.
What was the other one? Was that social unrest?
No, they're both foreign policy.
Both foreign policy.
Aside from the foreign policy keys, there are only 3 keys now. So I think I said, a month ago or so in my video that didn't matter. Even if both those keys flipped negative, it wouldn't change the prediction. I've since decided probably the most accurate way of assessing those keys is to split them, which I think is an accurate reflection of diplomacy under Biden. I give the administration a failure for Gaza because Gaza is a humanitarian catastrophe with no end in sight. I give the administration a success in Ukraine because it was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West that stopped Putin from conquering Ukraine and then threatening America's national security by going after our NATO allies. So that's a total of 4 keys down, a 2-key cushion. So even if something, and I don't expect it, went horribly wrong in Ukraine and it flipped the success key, it wouldn't change the prediction.
And President Biden yesterday made his final appearance before the United Nations General Assembly. Given your expertise on U.S. elections and foreign policy, how do you view the Biden administration's decision to utilize remaining military aid for Ukraine through a workaround method, especially as congressional support becomes fractured.
Yeah.
Is it a sign of a potential shift in American foreign policy, or does it reflect the typical ebb and flow of political resistance in Washington?
It reflects the typical ebb and flow. Franklin Roosevelt, in the run up to World War II, was faced with a very negative Congress. And even though it was Democratic, the home party, and he went around the Congress in a number of ways, including an executive agreement with Britain, the so-called destroyers for bases deal. He would send battle Britain in return for Britain giving America certain bases in the Caribbean. So I think what Biden is doing is the right thing, and it's not out of line with what other presidents have done.
And I noticed that you didn't allude to Afghanistan as a military failure. A lot of Republicans were trying to emphasize, the Biden administration's Afghanistan withdrawal as a major failure of his administration during the Republican National Convention. I've always thought that withdrawing from Afghanistan, if you're going to do it, was wise to do it in the first year, because it kind of creates some distance, in a society where where folks' attention span is very short, to be blunt. That it would create some distance between not just the midterm, but the reelection campaign or 2024 campaign. Yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's right. I debated about Afghanistan. We just saw conflicting reports coming out of the Congress. As you say, it's been overshadowed by Gaza and Ukraine vastly. Republicans, of course, have tried to make it a big deal, but it doesn't seem to be registering. But the bottom line is I did not have to decide that, because there's only one failure key, and I returned it against the Democrats. So I can't turn it twice. All right, we need to wrap up pretty soon.
Of course. Before we wrap up, there are those who say, well, certain keys like the charisma key are subjective. What is your argument that these are actually objective keys that are not based on who you're talking to? Because some folks will say, well, Kamala Harris is charismatic, or Donald Trump is charismatic.
I've heard this for 40 years. When I first developed the keys back in 1981, my first prediction was Ronald Reagan in April of 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time, when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again. His approval ratings were down in the gutter, the kind of approval ratings that Cenk would have said he can't possibly win. That was my first prediction. And I was blasted by the professional forecasters because, indeed, I had committed in their eyes the sin of subjectivity, that my keys were not just cut and dried indicators. And my answer was, that's right. And that enabled me to be much more accurate, because I can include a much wider range of indicators. And they're not subjective, they're judgmental, but they're very tightly constrained judgments. When you read my book, Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House 2024, or you catch my live show every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern at Allan Lichtman YouTube, you'll see the keys are tightly defined, and I've answered them since 1860. Well, it took the professional forecasters about 15 to 20 years, and then they swiveled their heads 180 degrees on the keys. They realized these big fancy models that tried to reduce everything to statistics didn't work. They couldn't predict elections. They couldn't even predict the economy one quarter to the other. And they realized the most effective predictions were a model like the keys that combine cut and dried indicators like economic growth with my judgmental indicators. And all of a sudden, the keys were the hottest thing in forecasting. I twice keynoted the International Forecasting Summit, an entire special issue of the premier practical forecasting magazine, Foresight, were devoted to the keys to the White House as a particularly effective means of predicting presidential elections. I published in the International Journal of Forecasting, the Harvard Data Science Review. I presented at the American Political Science Association. So you would think that would put to rest the idea of the keys being subjective, but no, I get it every year. And yes, the one I've gotten big time this year is, how can you say Donald Trump is not charismatic. Well, you've got to pay attention to the definition of the key and how the key has been answered. You can't just give me your subjective impression. The key requires that the candidate be a once in a generation, across the board, transformational candidate. And whatever you may, and the iconic examples, because I've answered this question, are Franklin Roosevelt on the Democratic side, who built the Democratic coalition, and Ronald Reagan on the Republican side, who built the conservative coalition of our time.
And so, Professor
Donald Trump, whatever you may think of him, doesn't come close to fitting the criteria of the key, because however he is to a narrow base, and that's not the definition of the key. In 4 years as president, his approval rating averaged 41%. The base, the narrow appeal, right at the bottom historically of presidents. In 2 elections, he lost the vote of the people by a combined 10 million votes. FDR and Reagan won 6 elections by landslides. So you actually look at the definitions of the keys and how they've been answered. Even seemingly, very difficult keys like charisma become crystal clear.
So thank you so much, Professor. And 4 years ago, I had you on my show for the first time. Are you nervous? I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you then. Are you nervous about anything potentially any unpredictable factor changing the trajectory of the course of events that ultimately change the results and therefore rendering the keys incorrect this time?
The biggest myth in American politics is the October surprise. For 40 years, I've been predicting before any October surprise could arise. And I've never changed my predictions, even again, as critics pepper me. Oh, things have changed. You got to change your prediction. Donald Trump has bragged on tape about sexually assaulting women. You can't be predicting Trump anymore. And I say, no, the keys look at the big picture of the strength and performance of the White House party. They don't change according to these events. So we've never had an October surprise that has affected the keys. Look, can I be wrong? Of course. I'm a human being. Any human being can be wrong. There's always possibly some catastrophic eventuality could be so enormous as to change 160 years of an historical pattern on which the keys are based. But the problem is, and every social scientist knows this, you can't know that in advance. That's only discernible after it occurred. That's why I don't fool around with my keys, no matter how much pressure I get.
Well, Professor, I wish we could talk longer, but I appreciate your time. You're an American treasure. I thank you for what you've brought to the political mic and what you brought to the country, the clarity that you've brought to every election since 1984. Thank you all so much for tuning in. With that being said, that's going to conclude today's episode of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for what you do, bringing people like me to your audience.
Thank you, sir. And again, I want to put a plug in for your show, Professor Lichtman's show. You'll be live Thursday night at 9, correct?
Yes, I'll be live tomorrow night at 9 p.m. every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9. We've had some technical difficulties in the last couple of shows, but they'll be solved. And at Allan Lichtman YouTube.
Yes, and follow him on TikTok. Follow him on Twitter, on Discourse, on Instagram. He's got it all, and his son Sam is amazing. Thank you so much, Professor.
Take care, Mike. Bye-bye.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.